This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan intellectual tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
Let's begin with Incarnation itself. If there is a key for describing the Franciscan intellectual tradition, I think the one that I would choose is its treatment of the role of the Incarnation. Francis is certainly the founder of this tradition. It's developed by Bonaventure and further developed by Scotus. But we could add here many other authors. You could study every Franciscan author and ask, what is his or her approach to the issue of incarnation? We must begin by saying, however, that Francis did not invent a new theology. The sources of what we call the Franciscan tradition go back much further in Christian history. Francis himself was the heir of a tradition. He was not the inventor of it, but he had a unique synthesis, a kind of spiritual vision or intuition, which spoke to people of his time as something fresh and new. One of the projects that I hope will be done in the future is a closer look at the theological sources for Francis's own vision. And I think they're primarily sources from the liturgy. And I suspect behind that the influence of the Greek fathers, probably through the breviary. Let's begin by looking at Francis and the humility of the Incarnation. This is a theme that has captivated artists. The story of Francis and the Christmas crib at Greccio lends itself both to dramatic presentations, to musical presentations, to painting, to sculpture. Those of you who have ever visited the sanctuary, the hermitage at Greccio, will certainly recognize the importance of this for artists. In fact, that place has become a kind of museum of nativity scenes, good and bad, from around the world. It was one of the inspirations for Giotto in painting the frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis. His evocation of the scene at Greccio is, I think, a beautiful representation of Francis, the vision of the priest who celebrates the Mass, in seeing the child Christ coming alive during this celebration. Thomas of Celano describes it as something new and fresh. In his Life of Francis, in chapter 30, the ending of the first book of this excellent piece of Franciscan theology, Thomas speaks of this event at Greccio as being an enactment, and speaks of Francis's intention, giving him these words: "I wish to enact the memory of that babe who was born in Bethlehem, to see in Bethlehem, to see as much as possible with my own bodily eyes the discomfort of his infant needs." Not only is this a representation of the mystery of the Incarnation, but the form that it takes is an incarnate form. I hope you can see the importance of this. It would be one thing for Francis simply to talk about the Incarnation. It's another thing for Francis to incarnate the Incarnation. The presence of animals in that Giotto fresco, they're very tiny, the presence of animals in a liturgical setting already mixes up some of the categories that we're used to. Francis combines religious theater and liturgical rite, revealing the incarnate word concretely, visibly, tangibly. That text, the whole chapter, chapter 30 of the Life of Francis, is probably the first theological treatment of incarnation in the view of Francis. If you read it carefully, you'll notice that Thomas evokes the animals being brought to the manger, the hay being placed in the manger, the way that the boulders and rocks echo back the voices of the crowd, and how the trees growing on the hillside of Greccio serve as a kind of sounding board for the singing of the friars and the congregation. It's night, so it's dark, but the people have brought torches and lamps to light up the night. What do we have there? Light and darkness, trees, rocks, animals, human beings. We have the elements of the Genesis creation story. All of them present in a liturgy in which the participants are all of the creatures. The words spoken by Francis as he sings the gospel of the Nativity are giving voice to all of these creatures who are wanting to speak the word. It's a marvelous meditation on what it means to understand the world in terms of the Incarnation. And it already, I think, indicates to us some of the creativity of Francis in making the word become concrete for people in a way that his contemporaries, mostly illiterate, could understand. By hearing the word proclaimed and by seeing the word enacted. When we move from Francis to Bonaventure, that's a big jump. There are certainly many steps that we could take in between. We could talk about Clare and the Incarnation, Alexander of Hales in the Incarnation, John of La Rochelle in the Incarnation. We're leaving out lots of pieces to cover just the highlights. This could certainly be filled in with text, extensive text from the writings of these Franciscan authors. I'm jumping to Bonaventure simply as the next best known landmark in the Franciscan intellectual tradition. The theology of the incarnate word in Bonaventure is the incarnate word as exemplar. What he will say is that this word, incarnate, we can really think quite concretely of that scene at Greccio, is the model or the blueprint in the mind of God. This is a vision that God has for the world, the incarnate word as exemplar for the making of all things. We might say that the incarnate word, the humanity of Christ, is the prototype. In a kind of mass production society, we use a different language. The prototype used by an expert artisan, Bonaventure says, as is evident in the case of shoemakers. We say, what? What? He said, sure. What does a master shoemaker put up on the desk as the model for the shoes that are going to be made in his shop? He makes the finest shoe that he can and puts it up there so that the other shoes made there, let's say by apprentices or by other master shoemakers, will resemble that shoe. And by looking carefully at shoes that are made from that shop, you'll be able to say, ah, that's definitely a Luigi shoe. I would recognize that shoe anyplace. Oh, that's a Giovanni shoe. Yeah, that I can see the prototype that they had behind that. Not because everything created in that shop is identical to it. No, it's not mere repetition, but rather is inspired by the beauty of that design, that model, that exemplar. For Bonaventure, all divine expression outwards is marked by the exemplar, the incarnate word. If we want to use a medieval technical term for this, emanatio, emanation, we would probably need to translate, and I'm not sure what would be the best word to translate that into contemporary English. The basic idea behind it is that once this exemplar is conceived, all of the creative energy that flows out from God as expression is marked by that prototype. Now, I'm saying a prototype in the mind, but it's not really mental. We might say it's in the heart. The chief desire and intention of God in creating is the expression of that prototype or model in diverse ways, very diverse ways. Bonaventure's fundamental belief, though, is that everything that has been created by God has been created through and in light of that prototype, of the Word incarnate in Jesus. For that reason, all the products resemble the prototype. There is a sense of, we're looking at this rock and say, oh, I think that was created by God. Why? Well, it has the marks of the incarnate word to it. First, because it's material, because it's tangible, because it's visible, that is an indication of its divine origin. How different from many other traditions in theology that tend to depreciate what is specific, what is concrete, what is tangible, as being unlike God's creative work. Can you see how this Franciscan tradition turns it exactly backwards? It is itself, by being concrete, an expression of this prototype. It is not the idea of Christ which is the prototype. It is the incarnate Word in Jesus who is the prototype. All things return to their divine source through the exemplar. Reductio, or reduction, the Latin term, actually formed from two words, ducere, to lead, and reducere, to lead again, to lead back. Everything has come forth through the Word as emanation. Everything returns to its source through the Word as reductio. It's led back. What this implies, of course, is that the destiny of creation is not destruction and annihilation. The destiny of creation is sharing in divine life. We could think of it as almost a frisbee or a yo-yo thrown out to the furthest end of its trajectory only to return, pouring out and leading back. It's a very simple process to describe. But again, as we begin to think about implications for that, what does it mean for the human being, Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word, to be the prototype of all of creation? What does it mean for someone who is limited, who is historical, who is finite, who is creature, to be the expression, the fullest expression of God's creative life? And to believe that that person is in fact now eternally in the Godhead, still with his humanity intact, with his physicality intact, his materiality not destroyed but taken up into divine life. Does that give us kind of an optimistic view of the human person, the creation, and the firstborn of many creatures, who's leading a kind of procession of the creatures back to their source? It's not Armageddon, but a new creation. Jumping ahead, again, now we've jumped about another 50 years to John Duns Scotus. I thought that it would probably be easier to approach some of these topics by themes rather than trying to give a complete presentation of all of the views of each of these thinkers. This is highly simplified, I hope not simplified to the point of error. Scotus would not see himself as an imitator of Bonaventure. I think he had a respect for Bonaventure, but he disagreed with him about all kinds of things. What kind of continuity is there between Bonaventure and Scotus? We could make we'd have to make a lot of elaborate conditions for talking about dependence. But I think we can see some commonality. Maybe that's all we can hope for within our tradition, some commonality of purpose. The classic question that is posed today as it was posed in the time of Scotus: would Christ have come if Adam had not sinned? And we know that then as now, the answer of the majority of those within Christian theology would be a resounding no. We'll be exploring this a little bit later with more depth when we talk about the issue of salvation. But just focusing on the fact of the incarnation, would Christ have come if Adam had not sinned? Scotus's answer, strangely enough, is a resounding yes. Why? The incarnation of the Word is the first intention of God. It's an expression of God's freedom. Nobody's telling God that an incarnation is necessary or good or laudable. Rather, it is God's free expression. It's an expression of divine generosity, love that tends to express itself outwardly. Francis calls this the poverty of God, that constant outpouring of what is within toward those who are outside. The incarnation is God's first intention. Therefore, creation, as we know it, is a consequence of the decision of the incarnation. Put very baldly, the reason why there is something and not nothing is Christmas. The incarnation is God's first intention. The consequence is, well, then there needs to be a creation in which the incarnation can take place. If God's first intention is Christ, we might say that the very next intention of God is Mary. The first Adam and the first Eve in the Franciscan tradition are not those characters described at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Chronologically, they come first, but chronology is not important to God. In intentionality, in God's intention, what is first is Christ, and we might say what is second is Mary. The basis of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. It's not that Mary is lacking something. Oh, poor Mary, you know. She doesn't have sin, doesn't have original sin. She's missing something. What is she missing? She's missing something that we think is an essential component of humanity. What? Sin! Got to have sin to be human. That's not the vision of the Franciscan tradition. Mary is the vision of what it means to be a human person, completely alive. She is the first Eve. She's a picture of what a person should be, what a person is deep down. Christ is the first Adam, Mary is the first Eve. We read history backwards, starting from Bethlehem and going to Eden. This decision was freely undertaken as an expression of divine identity. That is, it reflects who God is, this God who is generous love, which will always tend to express itself outwardly. The Latin phrase bonum diffusivum sui, that the good tends to express itself outwardly by its very nature as good. Or we might say that a good shared is a good increased. And that the intention of God is actually widening the circle of divine life, rather than keeping it as proprium, as property. The first example of poverty is God in the decision of incarnation. This means it is not caused, the incarnation is not caused, provoked, occasioned, stimulated, hinted at because of some lesser good. That is because of sin. I think if there's one refreshing notion within the Franciscan tradition, it's let's lighten up on sin a little bit. I've just been reading a fascinating doctoral dissertation done probably 40 years ago at the Antonianum, which is on the teaching of original sin in the works of John Duns Scotus. And he comes up with this rather charming notion. He said that sin would be possible even in the Garden of Eden, before what we call the fall. That in the natural state, venial sin is perfectly possible. There's no reason to have sinless human beings in order for them to be human. That even before the fall, venial sin is something that we can certainly accept, not only in Adam and Eve, but horror of horrors, even in Christ himself. This is not an expression of a rupture of a relationship with God. It's about being finite. It's about being limited. It's about being human. Why should we be so worried about it? Is it something that causes that much grief? This is in the pre-lapsarian state, before the advent of that kind of break of the covenant with God. But it's a sense of looking at humanity with a little bit more optimism, looking at human frailty and weakness as something at times simply to be accepted. Or one of the great insights of Scotus, to look at a lot of things in human life as simply neutral acts. Everything doesn't have to be good or bad. Some things are just neutral. The Incarnation is a concrete expression of divine nature and love. The emphasis here is on the word concrete. That God, within the Franciscan tradition, tends to concretize, to make specific, to make visible. God does not remain abstract or theoretical because God is so essentially real. That the relationships within the Trinity themselves are personalized and real. They are not just ideas or feelings. They are persons. So here, the Incarnation shows us a snapshot, if you like, an image, a model of what it means to be divine. This is actually very different from what we hear most often. Let me give you an example. The frequently recurring expression, well, what do you want? I'm only human. I'm only human. Can you see how that minimizes humanity? We could say equally well, I am only divine. Do we say that? No, we don't. We shudder when we think about that. Because we have, for the most part, imbibed a theology that speaks of divinity as outside limitation. That we cannot know what is divine, what is eternal, through what is limited, historical, frail, weak, capable of suffering, capable of growing old, capable of dying. The sustained Franciscan intellectual meditation on the Incarnation says, if you want to see what it means to be divine, look at Jesus of Nazareth. It's a Johannine theology in some of its roots. Philip, how long have you been with me? And still you do not understand. Oh, it's been great, visiting with you. We've had 3 years of initial formation as disciples with you, Lord. Now we're ready for the main act. We would like to see the Father. And Jesus' reaction, Philip, this is it. This is the full revelation of the Godhead. You with the fish have been out in the boat and you smell like that. I'm supposed to believe that this is the revelation, the fullness of the revelation of who God is. That's the challenge of the Incarnation in the Franciscan tradition. It turns heaven on its head by putting heaven on earth and defying us to find some God who is not the God whom we see in Jesus Christ. That makes us very nervous because we want the God who is everything that we are not, who is unlimited, incapable of suffering, who does not know limitation. This concrete expression of divine life, of divine being, who comes to us in the form of limitation and history, makes us very nervous because we have denied our own humanity. And Joe Kenichi has given a nice expression to this at the Franciscan Forum in Denver a number of years ago. He said, this is the scandal of the Incarnation. The Word has dirty feet. We spend so much of our time trying to get away from our own messiness and our own humanity. This creature is the first of all creatures. And yes, God has come as creature, but not isolated, not without relationship, as brother to a complete system of brother and sister creatures of whom he is the first. But all of them will share in that destiny, which is the destiny of glory. There's a beautiful example from this, and as I'm thinking about it, it would be a very appropriate image to put here. The image of the icon of the baptism of the Lord, which is used in the Eastern churches and is brought out for January 6th, which is the Feast of the Manifestation. If you've ever seen it, let me describe it. It might come to mind. It's a picture of the naked Christ in the waters of the Jordan. There's some fish in the water. There are little streams running down from the mountains, usually a couple of birds up there, some trees, and John the Baptist standing by the side of the Jordan. The reading of this icon in the Byzantine tradition is that through the waters of the Jordan, all of creation becomes aware of the presence of the incarnate Word. As those 2 feet come down into the water, all of the waters of the world, symbolized by those streams that touch the Jordan, going out into the oceans, all of them are touched now by divinity through the dirty feet of the Word incarnate. And the fish represent the creatures of the sea, the birds, the creatures of the air. John the Baptist is there to stand for humanity. And all those rocks and trees, as at Greccio, are witnesses of this baptism. It is as a creature among creatures that divine life flows from the baptism, the revelation of the incarnate Word. It's an image that I think would be inspiring within our Franciscan tradition, how God is present as a creature among creatures.